My name is David Marler. I'm a UFO researcher and author. I've been investigating the subject for 25 years actively. My first introduction to the UFO subject was actually at the age of 5, living in the St. Louis area at the age of 5 years old. In 1973, there was a wave of UFO activity in and around the city of Piedmont, Missouri, which is in southeast Missouri. And at that time, they were seeing nocturnal lights and objects in the sky, and it basically was what we call now a wave or flap of UFO sightings that was occurring at that time. My father's best friend growing up, because he was from that area, was one of the primary witnesses. That was one of the first witnesses to see these nocturnal lights. And I remember my father at the age of 5 saying if his friend said he saw it, he saw it. And many people from the St. Louis area were traveling down to Piedmont, Missouri to quote unquote look for UFOs. The story had garnered a lot of attention with the newspaper in St. Louis as well as television news channels. And they were going down, filming, interviewing witnesses. And my father, my older brothers, my older sister piled in the car on a number of occasions on weekends during this time frame to go down like everyone else to look for UFOs. And although they never did see a UFO themselves, they came back with these stories of people that they had talked to. So, from a secondary standpoint, I heard about these accounts. It fueled my interest and imagination at the age of 5. And after that, 2 years later in 1970, or actually in 1977, 4 years later, my sister and brother-in-law had a sighting outside of Kansas City, Missouri. That was very dramatic, very close, a true close encounter. And it terrified them. And for years after, I would hear them relay this story. And looking back on it, it suggested that maybe it was more than just a sighting that had occurred. Then 1 year after that, in 1978, another wave of UFO activity, and in this case, cattle mutilations, was occurring in and around the area known as Ellsbury, Missouri, north of St. Louis. And again, it garnered a lot of local media attention, newspaper, television news crews, etc. So it was a series of events in my early childhood where I consistently kept hearing about these UFOs, although never having seen or experienced one myself. Then jumping forward to 1990 is when I first heard about the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON. And I was then put in touch with Mr. Forrest Crawford in Southern Illinois and became a member of the MUFON. Started off as a field investigator trainee, field investigator, state section director, and ultimately took over as the Illinois state director for MUFON. Began to engage in educational lectures for adult and school groups, doing numerous investigations in the state of Illinois for MUFON. And then in January 5th, 2000, on that date, we had a significant UFO sighting involving multiple police precincts as well as civilian witnesses, who all reported this large triangular UFO moving very low altitude over the area around Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. And so that really launched kind of my name out into the public because it was a very high profile case that I investigated. And from that point, as I was interviewing these police officers, I was already familiar with the wave in Belgium from 1989 to 1991. And as I'm sitting interviewing these police officers in Southern Illinois, I quickly realized that what they were sketching, what they were describing, the flight characteristics, matched what was being reported in Belgium just 10 years prior. And I found that very intriguing because I knew these police officers had no knowledge of those sightings, and the similarities were striking. And based on the fact that we have these two significant reports in Belgium and Southern Illinois with commonalities, I decided to go ahead and start doing an exhaustive historical review of other cases involving these triangular UFOs, because one of the other things I had noted was the increased frequency of reports. Back in the day, in the 40s and the 50s, we were all familiar with flying saucers, flying discs, but something was changing in the reporting with these UFOs, and more prevalent were these triangular UFO reports. So over a 13-year period, roughly, I started amassing a huge collection of case files, material, and then parsing the data and looking for commonalities in the reports, common characteristics. I worked up a working profile, if you will, of these triangular UFOs, put together a comprehensive timeline showing that these reports not only went back to the 80s and the 90s, but in point of fact, went back to the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, And the earliest accounts I have in Scientific America go back to 1882. So there's an argument out there that these triangular UFOs must be military in origin. And I would agree, and I would state on the record that some of these triangular UFOs probably are military aircraft of some type, of some nature. But when you look at the historical timeline, I think it begs the question that perhaps some of these triangular UFOs are someone else's technology. Insofar as differentiating between those that might be military or, let's just say, non-terrestrial, for a simple description, the things that I look for that are highly unusual, the anomalous characteristics, if you will, nonlinear movement. In other words, if we're dealing with a triangular aircraft, like let's say a B-2 stealth bomber, for example, they fly in a linear pattern. When they turn, they make a wide radius bank or turn, like conventional aircraft. These objects, the anomalous ones, if you will, they will fly in a straight line and then suddenly make a flat right angle turn, literally pivot in midair, and then suddenly shoot off at a right angle. And so that's highly anomalous, highly unusual for conventional aircraft. Another characteristic beyond the sheer scale of these triangular UFOs, which some have been estimated to be 300 feet long, which is significant considering the B-2 stealth bomber is only 172 feet in width. These things, in some cases, are equilateral triangles estimated to be 300 feet on each length. But beyond the sheer scale, the size of these objects, is the fact that they have complete absence of sound. And many of the witnesses that I've interviewed have stated it wasn't just the sheer size of looking at this object, but the absence of sound. Witnesses told me on a number of occasions we felt like it was just going to fall on us because we didn't hear any aircraft or engine noise to keep this thing aloft. And so they're highly significant, highly emotional sighting reports. It's one thing to see a light in the sky, and I've interviewed numerous people over the years that have had light in the sky reports, or seeing a small disc-shaped object zipping across the sky. These triangular UFO reports, when you talk to the witnesses, and I'm talking about bank presidents that I've talked to that have witnessed this, Catholic priests, and especially police officers, hardened law enforcement officers that are used to seeing things, there is emotion in their testimony as they're sitting there relaying it. In fact, a number of police officers that have spoken to me about their sightings as I was interviewing them said, if you would have come through that door a year ago and told me you investigated UFOs, I'd say get out of my office. But then suddenly they'd get very somber and state, but whatever I saw, it wasn't anything that we could have possibly had. That's their testimony. And the emotion, you can see them get agitated, you can see them get very apprehensive as they relate what occurred, because many of these triangular UFOs are only estimated to be 500 to 1,000 feet above their head. So there's an intimidation factor. These are highly emotionally charged experiences for many of these individuals, both law enforcement as well as other witnesses. I've had a lot of pilots that have seen these things, witnessed these objects, military, active and retired, that have reported seeing these triangular UFOs. And in my investigation, I'm not an expert on aircraft design and aviation, but I've enlisted the aid of those that have worked on projects. I've interviewed aerospace engineers from British Aerospace. I've interviewed Boeing, McDonnell Douglas aerospace engineers, some that were involved in highly compartmentalized classified projects, specifically in the area of advanced propulsion design. And they have stated on the record to me that we are working on concepts that might lend to some of the flight dynamics that have been reported in these UFO sightings, but based on their testimony to me, they state we have nothing to where it's a working prototype or model of the scale that these witnesses have described. And one of the things I always like to point out as well with the Belgian wave, as well as many of the other historical cases that I've pulled from Air Force Project Blue Book files, for example, a number of reports involving not only multiple witness sightings of these objects, but radar confirmation. And I think that's important. Many people can dismiss visual sightings as hallucination and misinterpretation of prosaic items or objects, but when you have radar confirmation, that really adds another layer of credibility to these reports. And in fact, during the Belgian wave, they had 4 separate NATO ground-based tracking stations observing and tracking one of these triangular UFOs. It was enough to warrant the Belgian military to dispatch 2 F-16s to try to get a closer look and identify these objects. And the pilot, his name was Yves Mielsberg, actually locked on multiple times with onboard radar on his F-16, but each time he locked on, the objects would just tear away at blistering speed and make acute right-angle turns at high speeds. And another characteristic, which answers the question, how do you differentiate maybe conventional aircraft from the more anomalous triangular UFO reports? We have a number of cases where they've been tracked on radar and visually tracked, where we can estimate that these objects moved at supersonic speed, yet there's no sonic boom. So it really defies physics as we know it to see something like that occur. And again, aerospace engineers have stated we have certain techniques that might minimize or, to an extent mitigate the sonic shock wave that's created when planes go hypersonic, supersonic, but they're still perplexed by that characteristic of these objects. And another characteristic, in addition to traveling fast, in some cases, these triangular UFOs are reported to relocate. In other words, they're over in this portion of the sky, and then in another second, it's suddenly over to the witness's right. And they don't track the object visually moving. It literally pops from one location to another. And so that's another characteristic that's highly unusual in this particular instance. In researching historical cases as well as the January 5th, 2000 incident, in that particular case, the latter case, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Scott Air Force Base. The fact we had this large triangular UFO reported by multiple police officers so close to a military base warranted that request. As an investigator, we have to turn over every stone. And to be quite honest, at first I thought maybe this was something military that these individuals had seen simply because of the proximity to Scott Air Force Base. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request asking a series of questions. Specifically, were you operating any top secret vehicle? Were there military operations going on, or were you supporting military operations in that area at that time that might lend credence to these officers maybe seeing something military? Answers came back negatory. And in fact, they stated that their radar system was down at the time of the sighting. But the Freedom of Information Act is an important tool. Other researchers have actually used it much more widely than I have in their investigations. The problem with the Freedom of Information Act, though, is you have to be very specific in your request. You can't simply say, I want all UFO documents or files pertaining to the term UFO or flying saucer. And in some cases, you have to know the department by which you want to request this information. And even then, if you're requesting it from the Air Force, is that just the Secretary of the Air Force? Is that OSI, Office of Special Investigation? So you have to be specific in the department that you're requesting. You have to be specific in the search terms that you're requesting, and also time frame. Are you talking a 10-year period? Are you talking about a specific date? And even then, key terms. If you're requesting something regarding a certain project, you need to know what that project name was. Sometimes they have a public name for a project. Sometimes they have a secured name or a classified name for that project. You need to make sure that you put all that search criteria into your request. And so the Freedom of Information Act can be an important tool. Now, luckily, from an investigative standpoint, and this helped me with writing my book on triangular UFOs, is the fact that many of these documents are already publicly accessible. For example, Air Force Project Blue Book files are now available online. You don't have to file a request. The British MOD, Ministry of Defense, their files have now been released and are widely accessible online. And many of those files I had to incorporate into my book because they were chock full of very good quality cases. Again, visual, but visual sometimes with radar confirmation as well. So the Freedom of Information Act can be a very good tool, but you have to know what you're asking for when you apply for it. After my book was published on triangular UFOs, I was amazed at the response. Namely, my attitude was, I want to write the book to get the information out there. What I wasn't fully prepared for was the volume of testimony, volume of eyewitness reports that suddenly I was receiving worldwide. Readers were picking up my book, digesting the information. Some individuals had emailed me and contacted me saying they had never read a UFO book, but they had a triangular UFO sighting years ago and happened to just stumble across my book, or a friend referred them to it. And suddenly I was getting an influx of additional reports. In fact, some of the historical cases I wrote about in the book, although prior to writing the book had no knowledge of their sighting, they contacted me stating, you wrote of this report in November of 1980 over the state of Missouri. I was one of those witnesses. So it really helped bolster some of the case material I already had on some of these very specific cases. But in trying to avoid being typecast, if you will, or stereotyped as the triangle guy, as some people have referred me to in the UFO field, I wanted to branch out and let people realize that I have an extensive UFO library, not just on the triangular UFO phenomenon, but I have historical material going back to 1896, 1897, original newspapers from that time period, chronicling the airship sightings, for example, that were being reported at the time. A lot of documents from World War II, chronicling the Foo Fighter mystery, the ghost rockets over Sweden. But one of the cases, when I moved out to New Mexico 4 years ago, I wanted to try to investigate more thoroughly, was the wave of UFOs over Farmington, New Mexico. And just briefly, this involved thousands of witnesses, estimated thousands of eyewitnesses in broad daylight, which I think is a very important point to illustrate or highlight. And they witnessed not dozens, but hundreds of unidentified flying objects, flying individually, flying in formations, over the town of Farmington, New Mexico, which is up in the Four Corners region, up in the northwest corner of New Mexico. And these witnesses not only observed these objects, but their testimony was documented in the newspapers of the time. So we have historical records we can go back to and look at. And I found it dramatic. From a UFO investigative standpoint, we might have typically 1 or 2 witnesses to a UFO sighting, and maybe 1 or 2 UFOs were observed. In this case, we had thousands of witnesses to hundreds of objects over a 3-day period in broad daylight. It doesn't get much better than that from an investigative standpoint. Now, the problem was this occurred on March 15th, 16th, and 17th, way back in 1950. So we do have the passage of time that's gone by. So it's very difficult to get a hold of witnesses after that long passage of time. But I was able to track down a couple living eyewitnesses, interview them, and then also took a trip down to the University of Arizona where Dr. James McDonald, who was a very scientific UFO investigator back in the 60s, he interviewed these individuals years after the fact. And something that no one had ever done was go down and look at Dr. McDonald's files. And he had a very thick file with detailed interview notes of not only the witnesses that were mentioned in the newspaper, but I have over a dozen witnesses, additional witnesses mentioned by name with detailed interviews that were conducted by Dr. McDonald in the late 60s. So we now have that material that we can correlate with the eyewitness testimony from the newspapers of the time. And in going through the newspaper archives, I was surprised to find that it was not an isolated case. It did not just occur in Farmington, New Mexico. There were reports in Tucumcari, New Mexico, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, New Mexico, extending all the way up into Colorado, and in fact, extending all the way down into Mexico. Mexico was having a wave of sightings at the same time over Monterrey, Mexico City, again involving multiple UFOs observed by dozens, if not hundreds of eyewitnesses, and again, documented in the newspapers of the time. I also went through government documents, Air Force Project Blue Book files, and found references to other sightings that had occurred. And then finding very unusual, let's just say, explanations put forth by the government and military at the time for the sightings, which simply did not fit the facts. And so I'm currently involved in investigating that, working on a new book to try to chronicle and better illustrate what took place during that month-long period in March of 1950, and hoping that that will shed some light on this case that, for the most part, has been ignored by the UFO research community all these years. Over the years, I've always tried to take a conventional approach to an unconventional topic, as I like to say. Look at the facts, see where the facts lead you, try to avoid any personal belief or bias that you might have. Simply follow the evidence. And that's what I've tried to do. And I've really tried to properly vet the material that I've investigated and more importantly, that I've lectured about. I always like to cite my references. I always like to let people know where I'm getting the information, because one of the goals as a researcher, investigator, and lecturer is to spark the audience's interest. This is what I have found out, but now I want you to take the next step. Help me try to understand this mystery more fully. And so if I can, spark that curiosity, spark that interest in other people, we need a collaborative effort. I can't do it alone. As I was remarking earlier to a friend this morning, I stated that I have a lot of data. Data doesn't necessarily equate to answers. So I'm still searching for those answers. And so we really need a collaborative effort. It's great that people are interested in the subject, but I would encourage those, if you're interested, take an active role. Become an active investigator, become an active researcher. Find what interests you specifically about the subject matter and run with that. Let that curiosity that's in your belly fuel you, push you. Because looking back now, I've been doing this for 25 years, I never thought I would be where I am today. I never thought I would write a book. I was always one of those people just out there with that curiosity. But as you delve into the subject more fully, you realize that there's something here. And after 25 years, I'm still trying to realize what that something is, but there's something here. And I always like to say, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a hell of a lot of smoke with this UFO subject.